The lieutenant reported Indian was shot through the right side but succeeded in escaping through the tangled underwood. His son, a little boy of 10 years old and very intelligent for an Indian, was taken a short time afterwards and reported that his father died amongst the rocks in a neighboring arroyo. With no mules for packing supplies, Kit Carson now informed General Carleton that the Canyon de Chelly expedition would have to be delayed. The general promptly replied, "You will not delay the expedition on account of lack of transportation. You will have the men carry their blankets and, if necessary, 3 or 4 days' rations in haversacks." On January 6, 1864, the soldiers marched out of Fort Canby. Captain Albert Pfeiffer led a small force which was to enter the east end of Canyon de Chelly. Kit Carson led a larger force which was to enter the west end. 6 inches of snow lay on the ground, temperature was below freezing, and the marching was slow. A week later, Pfeiffer entered the canyon. From rims and ledges, hundreds of half-starved Navajos hurled stones, pieces of wood, and Spanish curses upon the heads of the soldiers. But they could not stop them. Pfeiffer's men destroyed hogans, food caches, and livestock. They killed 3 Navajos who came within range of their muskets, found 2 elderly Navajos frozen to death, and captured 19 women and children. Carson, meanwhile, had established a camp at the west end and was scouting the canyon from the rims. On January 12th, one of his patrols encountered a band of Navajos, killing 11 of them. 2 days later, the 2 commands linked up. The entire canyon had been traversed without a major fight. That evening, 3 Navajos approached the soldiers' camp under a truce flag. Their people were starving and freezing, they told Carson. They chose to surrender rather than die. Quote, "You have until tomorrow morning," Carson replied. "After that time, my soldiers will hunt you down." Next morning, 60 ragged and emaciated Navajos arrived at the camp and surrendered. Before returning to Fort Canby, Carson ordered complete destruction of Navajo properties within the canyon, including their fine peach orchards, more than 5,000 trees. The Navajos could forgive the rope thrower for fighting them as a soldier, for making prisoners of them, even for destroying their food supplies. But the one act they never forgave him was for cutting down their beloved peach trees. During the next few weeks, as news of the soldiers' entry into Canyon de Chelly spread through the hidden camps of the Navajos, the people lost heart. Quote, "We fought for that country because we did not want to lose it," Manuelito said afterward. "We lost nearly everything. The American nation is too powerful for us to fight. When we had to fight for a few days, we felt fresh, but in a short time we were worn out, and the soldiers starved us out." On January 31st, Delgado, with his reassurances of conditions at Bosque Redondo, persuaded 680 more Navajos to surrender at Fort Wingate. Several severe winter weather and lack of food forced others to come into Fort Canby. By mid-February, 1,200 were there, hungry and destitute. The army issued them scanty rations, and the very old and the very young began to die. On February 21st, Herrero Grande came in with his band, and the numbers rose to 1,500. By early March, 3,000 had surrendered at both forts, and the trails to the north were filled with fearful Navajos approaching over the frozen snow. But the Rico chiefs, the rich chiefs Manuelito, Barboncito, and Armijo, refused to quit. With their people, they stayed in the mountains, still determined not to surrender. During March, the long walk of the Navajos to Fort Sumner and the Bosque Redondo was set in motion. The first contingent of 1,430 reached Fort Sumner on March 13th. 10 died en route. 3 children were kidnapped, probably by Mexicans among the soldier escort. Meanwhile, a second group of 2,400 had left Fort Canby. their numbers already reduced by 126 who had died at the fort. The long caravan included 30 wagons, 3,000 sheep, and 473 horses. The Navajos had the fortitude to bear freezing weather, hunger, dysentery, jeers of the soldiers, and the hard 300-mile journey, but they could not bear the homesickness, the loss of their land. They wept, and 197 of them died before they reached their cruel destination. On March 20th, 800 more Navajos left Fort Canby, most of them women, children, and old men. The army supplied them only 23 wagons. On the second day's march, the officer in command reported, a very severe snowstorm set in which lasted for 4 days with unusual severity and occasioned great suffering amongst the Indians, many of whom were nearly naked and of course unable to withstand such a storm. When they reached Los Pinos, below Albuquerque, the army commandeered the wagons for other use, and the Navajos had to camp in the open. By the time the journey could be resumed, several children had vanished. Quote, "At this place," a lieutenant commanded, "officers who have Indians in charge will have to exercise extreme vigilance, or the Indians' children will be stolen from them and sold." Unquote. This contingent reached the Bosque on May 11, 1864. Quote, "I left Fort Canby with 800 and received 146 en route to Fort Sumner, making about 946 in all. Of this number, about 110 died." I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico for 3 years, and many times I drove from Santa Fe to Albuquerque, which is about an hour drive, and I mean, and then north, and Pecos is still like a half hour outside of Santa Fe, so I mean, imagine walking in the winter, in a storm, that distance. Oh my God. The horror show of this. This is your history. This is your legacy, America. Colonialism. You know, genocide, cultural genocide. Genetics comes from eugenics. What's next? Here in the end of 2018. Late in April, one of the holdout chiefs, Armijo, appeared at Fort Canby and informed the post commander, Captain Asa Carey, that Manuelito would arrive in a few days with Navajos who had spent the winter far to the north along the Little Colorado and San Juan. Armijo's band of more than 400 came in a few days later, but Manuelito halted his people a few miles away at a place called Quelitas and sent a messenger to inform the soldier chief that he would like to have a talk with them. During the parley which followed, Manuelito said that his people wished to stay near the fort, plant their grain crops, and graze their sheep as they had always done. "There is but one place for you," Captain Carey replied, "and that is to go to the Bosque." "Why must we go to the Bosque?" Manuelito asked. "We have never stolen or murdered, and we have at all times kept the peace we promised General Canby." He added that his people feared they were being collected at the Bosque so the soldiers could shoot them down as they had at Fort Fauntleroy in 1861. Carey assured him that this was not so, but Manuelito said he would not surrender his people until he had talked with his old friend Herrero Grande or some of the other Navajo leaders who had been at the Bosque. When General Carleton heard that there was a chance of Manuelito surrendering, he sent 4 carefully chosen Navajos from the Bosque, but not Herrero Grande, to use their influence on the reluctant war chief. They did not convince Manuelito. One June night after they had talked, Manuelito and his band vanished from the Quelitas and went back to their hiding place along the Little Colorado. In September, he heard that his old ally, Barboncito, had been captured in the Canyon de Shelly. Now he, Manuelito, was the last of the Rico holdouts. and he knew the soldiers would be looking everywhere for him. During the autumn, Navajos who had escaped from the Bosque Redondo began returning to their homeland with frightening accounts of what was happening to the people there. It was a wretched land, they said. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets and herded them into adobe-walled compounds where the soldier chiefs were always counting them and putting numbers down in little books. The soldier chiefs promised them clothing and blankets and better food, but their promises were never kept. All the cottonwood and mesquite had been cut down so that only roots were left for firewood. To shelter themselves from rain and sun, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground and cover and line them with mats of woven grass. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. With the few tools the soldiers gave them, they broke the soil of the Pecos bottomlands and planted grain, but floods and droughts and insects killed the crops, and now everyone was on half rations. Crowded together as they were, disease had begun to take a toll of the weaker ones. It was a bad place, and although escape was difficult and dangerous under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, many were risking their lives to get away. Meanwhile, Star Chief Carleton had persuaded the Vicario of Santa Fe to sing a Te Deum in celebration of the army's successful removal of the Navajos to the Bosque. And the general described the place to his superiors in Washington, quote, as, quote, a fine reservation. There is no reason why they, the Navajos, will not be the most happy and prosperous and well provided for Indians in the United States. At all events, we can feed them cheaper than we can fight them, unquote. In the eyes of the Star Chief, his prisoners were only mouths and bodies. These 6,000 mouths must eat, and these 6,000 bodies must be clothed. When it is considered what a magnificent pastoral and mineral country they have surrendered to us, a country whose value can hardly be estimated, the mere pittance in comparison, which must at once be given to support them, sinks into insignificance as a price for their natural heritage, unquote. And no advocate of manifest destiny ever phrased his support of that philosophy more unctuously than he, quote, the exodus of this whole people from the land of their fathers is not only an interesting, but a touching sight. They have fought us gallantly for years on years. They have defended their mountains and their stupendous canyons with a heroism which any people might be proud to emulate. But when at length they fought it, but when at length they found it was their destiny to, as it had been that of their brethren, tribe after tribe, away back toward the rising of the sun, to give way to the insatiable progress of our race, they threw down their arms, and as brave men entitled to our admiration and respect, have come to us with confidence in our magnanimity, and feeling that we are too powerful and too just a people to repay that confidence with meanness or neglect. Feeling that having sacrificed to us their beautiful country, their homes, the associations of their lives, the scenes rendered classic in their traditions, we will not dole out to them a miser's pittance in return for what they know to be, and what we know to be, a princely realm. Manuelito had not thrown down his arms, however, and he was too important a chief for General Carleton to permit such incorrigibility to continue unchallenged. In February 1865, Navajo runners from Fort Wingate brought Manuelito a message from Star Chief, a warning that he and his band would be hunted down to the death unless they came in peaceably before spring. I am doing no harm to anyone, Manuelito told the messengers. I will not leave my country. I intend to die here.